Now I'd be lying if I said that the previous months hadn't been difficult, trying to come to grips with what happened to me that fateful day in the shopping centre, coming face to face with Michael Russell when he stared me down for not having a face covering on. So every time I'm forced to look in his direction again, I'm always somewhat fearful that he might catch my eye. But when I found out the devastating trail of destruction he had left in his wake at a independence speech stood under his blue umbrella, where he apparently defeated the big bad Michael Gove with a banging high IQ, high octave hot take in the days after the 2019 election, I knew that I had to sort of face my fears. But as I said, I would be lying if I was to sit here and say that I wasn't somewhat fearful. It's a very unplanned route to progress, it would seem. I don't think there's going to be an easy way to fix my issues. But can you blame me really when you were face to face with this, when all you wanted to do was oogle at the broccoli, the breathing at the back of your neck, and you turn to see Michael Russell? And you know what he wants. He knows that you know. But anyway, this isn't about me, this is about the devastating wake that he left Michael Gove in. And he spends the best part of the first 3, maybe 4 minutes stood under his blue umbrella, repeating similar talking points, which kind of centre around the notion that Boris Johnson is he's evil as he's declining Scotland's ability to, or denying Scotland's ability to, self-determine. He makes a reference or two to 700 plus years ago, to the Scots of old, or I forgot, Scots aren't a real people anymore, are we? We're just merely people that reside on Scotland. But, let's play along with the fantasy for a moment, shall we? But these people 700 plus years ago, they self-determined, and for some strange reason he's trying to harken back to those times, attribute our plight to their plight, when it couldn't be any more different when you consider the hypothetical endgame if we were to go along with the so-called independence that's on offer from Michael Russell under his blue umbrella. But again, this isn't me sitting here to denigrate the concept of independence, nor to really slag off his blue umbrella. I suppose he's quite cold, as it is quite a bad weather day, to say the least. But anyway.
And that's what we assert here today, the right of self-determination. Scotland isn't bigger or brighter than anywhere else, but it's just as good as anywhere else. And we cannot and will not be denied the rights that others rely on. We will not be imposed upon, because up there at the Abbey, when they signed that declaration, they signed something that said, government is a matter of consent, not imposition. That's the choice of how we organise ourselves. We have the right to choose our government. And that...
It's funny though, because obviously Michael Russell stood under his blue umbrella, of course, would have us be back into the European Union. And as we all know, one of the main gripes that many people had in the run-up to the EU referendum was the fact that you can't really vote for the bureaucrats in the EU, can you? So same argument could apply there technically, no? Or are we not allowed to talk about that? That's different. Nah, forget my bad.
Truth that doesn't change. It was true here 700 years ago, and it's true here today. But it's still not being heard in some places.
And it's right about this moment where he's going to change tact and he's going to tell us all about the story of Michael Gove. And if you aren't sitting down, I would suggest you sit down, because it was in and around the moment when he started to reveal this sad story, this marvellous story at the same time, where something came to me, some form of epitome, something I hadn't had for a while, admittedly. Where all these Vietnam-style flashbacks came pouring back into my head, where I was forced to remember all of the sheer fucking times, where I was forced to remember just a few segments throughout the Rainbow Unicorn Parliament's tirades over the years of sheer fucking hypocrisy. But it's fine. A hypocrisy that probably went over his head and landed on the blue umbrella.
And one of those places is 10 Downing Street.
Ooh.
Forget the fine words. Forget the lies. If the Tories believed in self-determination, they would be expressing it here. Just days after the 2019 election,
Here it comes.
I was at a meeting in London, and I said to Michael Gove, I respect the fact that you've won a mandate for Brexit in the English electorate. It almost stuck in my craw to say it, but I said it.
Oh, he said it. Oh my God. I can't believe he would say such a thing. And did he say it back? Of course. Michael Gove never said it back. Michael Gove didn't know what was coming next, of course, because Michael Russell wasn't finished. He was about to slam dunk him with a Russia jibe. Yeah.
It would stick in my craw now because we know it was illegally gained on Russian money. But I said it.
Oh.
What they have to say now is that we have the right.
So, obviously, I know it's difficult to maybe distinguish the burning embers on the floor, the devastation on display from Michael Russell. You might not have caught what he was trying to get out there, but me being a big brain, I'll point it out for you. I will spell it out. Because it was just chef's kiss hypocrisy from this fucking prick. Because that's what the SNP, to me, fundamentally are. A shower of shit. Disingenuous, hypocritical bastards. I'm sorry, pardon my French. If anybody's watching up until this point and they happen to be a fan of the SNP, then please do me a favour and fuck off. Because if you wish to stay, you might very well end up having to endure me going for a little time lapse where I showcase just how we got to this point. How we got to a point where Michael Russell is stood under his blue umbrella, spouting off nonsense while seemingly completely oblivious to the fact he's a fucking hypocrite. It's remarkable. That's standard procedure for the SNP at this point because hypocrisy, a lot of them reek off it. And then there's just Mary Black. She just reeks of flowjob more often than not. But that's a different story. But, he's talking about the fact that Westminster, or Michael Gove in this instance, he never reciprocated. He didn't produce the common courtesy to say that he respects their mandate. Oh, no. And that is just unacceptable. This is the same Michael Russell who represents the SNP, led by the thin-lipped feminist Nicola Bowlcut, headed Sturgeon, who in the election that he's talking about, as bear in mind this was 2 days after the 2019 election. What happened prior to the 2019 election? Can you remember, folks, how Nicola Thinlips spent the entirety of the run-up to that campaign? Just in case you can't remember, let's refresh the memories. Yes, that's right. While Michael Russell sits and whines about a lack of respect for our mandates.
Campaigning across Scotland this general election on Thursday the 12th of December. Scotland's at a crossroads. We can have a better future of a more prosperous, progressive, fairer society as opposed to another UK government that we didn't vote for. We can put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. Escape Brexit. Stop Boris.
By stopping Brexit, of course. That's screwing over the people of Wales, the people of England that voted to leave the EU. They love to remind us all on a regular basis as this becomes a common theme, had become a common theme for some time prior to this, something I caught on to, which kind of led to me cementing my opinions of the Thin Lips long ago. But, they kind of used the Scottish people as scapegoats, and I firmly believe it was done by design. Her own agenda, her own playbook, essentially, from videos from prior to the election, the way that she kind of coerced people to vote in the referendum, I should say, as opposed to election, and just the antics that followed after the fact, scapegoating the Scottish people, using every excuse possible to advocate for either a second EU referendum or in fact to just have an independence referendum, and it was because that's what the Scottish people voted for, we're being dragged out against our will, etc. But we'll come to that. But in this moment here, Michael Russell's still probably standing under his blue umbrella. Or maybe he's found somebody else to go and stare down. And maybe he's staring down Nicola, who's currently could be sat in a church somewhere without her mask, before she came back up to Scotland to tell us all to wear ours for another 2 weeks by law. Well, legislation anyway. But, anyway, point being, I've digressed there. We were told repeatedly for God knows how many months, years even, that the people of Scotland are being dragged out against our will, we're being cast aside, we're being ignored by the democracy denier, big bad Boris Johnson and Theresa May, etc. But yet, if they had their way, they would have stopped Brexit in its tracks. They would have screwed over the people that voted for it in the first place, including 1 million in Scotland, by the way. And what for? Oh, because Nicola Sturgeon, that's her dream, that's her ideal world, Nicola Sturgeon's quite content with the way things are, and have been for some time, as she's on a bit of a power trip at present, getting a bit more confident with each election cycle because her ardent base by this point have become so blinkered to anything else around them, they can't see past the fact that she's bullshitting them, really. Well, that's what it appears to me anyway. She uses every election cycle going with the same promise of independence, and when it doesn't come, blame Boris and just continue to implement the bullshit that you were implementing anyway, you know? It's always next time, folks. She's even doing the same thing with the council elections, holding off on any more independence, the independence bill, etc., until after the council elections. So that's kind of a nudge, nudge, wink, wink to go out and vote for the SNP councillors, yeah. Nonetheless, and this video didn't age well, did it, with big bad Derek Mackay?
And have the kind of society that we really want. We can do that as we take our message across the country with a really strong and positive reaction to our message and to our policies at this general election. But you know, the only poll that really matters is the poll on the 12th of December when Scotland goes out to vote. So let's ensure we can win for Scotland and vote for the SNP.
So as I said, the campaign that they were running with at the time of this election in 2019 was that they wanted to lock the Tories out, so you had to vote SNP, and they would hold the power. And by doing this, we could escape Brexit, and then we would put Scotland's future into Scotland's hands. But you'd be left in a bit of a quandary. Had that all come into effect, what would have happened? You know, what would have fucking happened? It would have been an absolute car crash. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that would have gone the way that some might have predicated at the time. Nonetheless, so Michael Russell complaining about a lack of respect for mandates. The SNP didn't exactly have much of a concern for their own mandate, as they spent the best part of 3 years trying to stop Brexit instead of allowing the process to play out in order for them to act upon the mandate that they obtained in 2016 via manipulation, if you ask me. Again, something I'll come on to. But there was something else. It wasn't just Michael Russell standing under his blue umbrella that pissed me off. It was another video that I actually came across. And it's something that I had seen before, but it was via a different website this time, as opposed to actually seeing it at First Minister's Questions. And it was on one of the little independence websites that they've got. I'm pretty sure Angus Robertson's behind it, or runs it anyway, or did at some point. And it's something I'd forgotten, despite the fact that it became really prominent. I can't pinpoint exactly when about this began, but I do remember it getting to the point where it was near enough every single fucking day different SNP politicians were picking up the mantle and doing it themselves, and then it got so embarrassing that they even had some of their cult followers all over Twitter and Facebook comment sections, etc., repeating these tropes when they were all baseless lies. In the sheer desperation that Nicola Thin-Lips was starting to feel the pressure mounting up, you know, Brexit could potentially occur, and the referendum that she'd been telling everybody that was going to come in due course seemed that it could potentially all be slipping out of her fat fingers, so she decided to take things up a notch. And again, this is more towards the end of the 2018-2019 period, maybe arguably the end of 2017 as well, I can't be certain. And that was, in fact, the revisionist history that began to become very prevalent. Once or twice was bad enough, but it became so persistent. Every single media appearance with Piers Morgan, here would be Nicola Thin-Lips. So when the questions would get posed, she had the answers. Most of the time it was the same answers she used on Sky and STV, etc, etc, BBC, everywhere. The revisionist history. Nobody ever pushed back. Nobody ever felt the need to call her out on her shit. She got away with it. That's become a common theme in Scotland. Why? I don't know. However, so on their little Yes website that they've got here, from the February the 3rd, 2022, unionist parties have nothing to offer, or nothing positive to offer, I should say. As opposed to Nicola Sturgeon, that's got so much to offer, you know. So much to offer. Yeah, of course she does. Yeah. She's just a barrel of laughs, a barrel of tricks, a barrel of surprises. Her and her party, a bunch of entrepreneurs and social engineers all in one. But this here, it just brought it all back to me. The Vietnam flashbacks, one after the other. And I do have examples of this on my channel somewhere of her doing this. I'd have to pull them out if I can be bothered, because it is getting late in the day, like, but you'll see it yourself here.
The promise made by the No campaign in 2014 has since been broken, and the crowning one of all of those, of course, was the fact that, according to them, the only way to protect Scotland's membership of the European Union was to vote no to independence. And here we are, ripped out of the EU against our will.
It's just a fucking lie. It's a fundamental lie. But she sits there, or stands there I should say, and says that, with her Byrlcreame nicely placed into position. Blatant lesbian allegedly, of course, but you know, standing there bold as brass, nonchalantly bullshitting, revising history for all to see, and she gets away with it. And she does it time after time after time after time again. Of course, the implication here is that the referendum in 2014 went the way that it did because of promises made regarding EU membership. She alleges in that clip there that the people that wanted Scotland to stay in the Union made a promise that the only way to retain that vital EU membership was to ensure that you remained part of the UK. That never fucking happened. It might have been brought up in conversation at one point or another, but it wasn't the fundamental focal point. It wasn't the fundamental argument that was day after day placed all over our TV screens. You know, coming from somebody who was just of voting age at the time, I recall pretty much every single TV appearance that Bellend, Alistair Darling made, Salmond. I remember most of the media narrative for the most part, and I don't recall that. And do you know what else I don't recall? I don't recall in the wake of the referendum result going the way that it did, that ever being used as the fucking example, and the reason for why. And in the years that followed, I don't recall that ever being used as the reason for why, or even being brought up for that matter. And then even when the EU referendum came around, I don't ever remember that, which she said there, being brought up at any point. In the weeks, the months, even the years prior to the revisionist history, after Brexit, or the referendum anyway, I never heard that being brought up. It just miraculously started to emerge out of fucking nowhere at the exact same time as Nicola Thinlips had decided to take it upon herself to take things up a notch and start bullshitting the world. You know? And of course she finishes off that little segment there with a little smirk, proverbial, with the dragged out against our will routine. And where did that come from? All in due course, you know. It just pisses me off remembering this shit segment by segment, how fucking obvious it was back then, but even more so now, how full of shit she is, her party is, what they're doing and what they intend. They've got a win-win, a permanent win-win as it goes, because they bullshit the populace, so they vote for an independence referendum that they ain't going to get, and then in the unlikelihood that they actually do obtain it, there's a win-win anyway, because then there's a possibility that they'll get back into the EU, and that's what they want, that's what they'd love, so they can pull ourselves and take, quote-unquote, all things will come to. However, so bear in mind, we've got Michael Russell standing there, professing to his indie supporters, so we need to start this, we need to really sort this out, because this irritated me the last time around as well. All this talk of independence, the Indie Ref 2 movement, all the independence marches, etc. It's not independence, it's an EU movement. You know, it's a fucking travesty to even assume that this is about independence, nor to call this an independence movement. It's been hijacked by fucking lefty dickheads like her. However, let's just go back to the start, shall we? Because I really do think that this is just another example of how abhorrent this boot can be when she wants to be. So as I said, the claim was that, you know, Scotland voted the way that it did in 2014 because we were all promised. We were promised that this, you know, it was the only way to retain the beautiful EU membership. Is that so? Is that fucking so? Aye, okay. And since we're taking a trip down memory lane, let's have a little flashback to Marianne, a victim of misogyny back, repeating the exact same trope that Nicola Thinlips had started to patter on about.
2014, as has been pointed out, Scotland voted to remain in the UK, and it did so on the promise that the only way to ensure our EU membership was through voting no to independence.
Oh, it was a promise. It was a promise, apparently. It's the first I've heard. You know, even Nicola Thinlips didn't go that far, but Mary Black, she took it up a notch herself. And this continues. I can't recall all the politicians that got involved in this shit, but as I said, it even started to spur on out to the fans, the cultists. So you were seeing it in random comment sections, all repeating word for word what the dickheads in Parliament had been saying, despite the fact it was shit. They initially had the go-to proof of a screenshot of the Better Together campaign, saying something about this in a tweet. But they totally disregarded history for what it was, and instead ran with the revisionist version. Standard procedure, because that's how the SNP roll. And if you are oblivious to politics or you don't pay much attention and you hear this rhetoric coming from them, you think that they've got a point. And that is the point. Because they don't have a fucking point more often than not. So this is a video from my channel that I uploaded a couple years ago. And the video on screen here is one of the few that I was able to find of Nicola Thinlips. This is even before the 2014 referendum. And she's asking here, or she's being asked, sorry, about the idea of Scotland voting for independence and retaining the EU membership, because that is what the SNP were claiming at the time. Scotland votes for independence and just inherits the UK's EU membership. That's what they were saying. So what does she say in response?
Contribution that Scotland makes to the European Union, and also the benefits, particularly in terms of jobs through the single market, that we get as a country from being part of the European Union. If Scotland votes to be independent in the referendum at the end of 2014, it is the strong position of the Scottish Government that we should continue to be a member of the EU because of the contribution we make and the benefits that we get.
Do you concede at all that there is some division in legal opinion and that some people do argue that you would have to reapply?
Well, I'm a lawyer by background. I know that if you have to...
I'm a lawyer by background, so I know what I'm talking about. Well, as it transpired, of course, she didn't know what she was talking about because the EU eventually had to come out and say that we would have to reapply. They didn't say that we would be banned permanently. Now, okay, there was talk though of Spain vetoing, so obviously that would have been sticking in Nicola Thinlips' little mind a bit. The potential that we could get our quote-unquote independence, which she doesn't really fucking want. You know, because it's all about the EU. The independence is worthless if we can't be in the EU. So let that sink in. It was clear back then, and it's as clear as day now. But that must have been sticking in her craw a little bit.
Lawyers, you'll end up with at least two different legal opinions. But I believe that although the law is important, and I would challenge anybody to find the treaty provision that would provide for Scotland or any part of the European Union territories being put outside of the European Union because they exercise their democratic right to self-determination.
But we're not a member, it was the UK, fuck's sake. But anyway, just bear in mind though, so we've established that, I hope. But the reason I brought this video up to begin with is because the revisionist history that I played prior, the assumption, or the allegation I should say, was that you know, we were all promised, you know, with a big bad promise, the only way to stay in the EU was to vote to remain. It was never brought up as a point of promise. But one thing that was said by herself here is
And what about the rest of the UK? What about the possibility of an in-out referendum in the UK? Could that not completely muddy the waters if your negotiations actually don't keep to the timetable that you set out?
Well, I believe our timetable is realistic, and as I've already said, others have expressed that view as well. I hope and I expect that by the time the UK has a in-out referendum, if that does happen, then Scotland by that time will have become an independent country. But I think the position of the UK government and David Cameron in particular does really underline the fact that the risk, the threat to Scotland's continuing membership of the European Union doesn't come from the prospect of Scottish independence. It comes from a growing Euroscepticism within the UK government and that possibility of an in-out referendum. I believe that would be the wrong road for Scotland to go down, but that would be the risk for Scotland if it opted to stay within the United Kingdom.
that would be the risk. That would be the risk if Scotland opted to stay within the United Kingdom. She acknowledged herself that there was a growing Euroscepticism emerging in the UK, and David Cameron was planning a referendum on the EU membership if he was elected. This was all common knowledge to people in and around this time. And her herself makes reference to the fact that remaining part of the UK could in turn lead to us potentially having our EU hotspot jeopardised. So remind me again how we managed to fast forward from here to a point where she manages to stand in our parliament with her hair gel and prattle on about fucking bullshit that's polar opposite to what she's saying here. It's remarkable. And naturally, I'm going to get detractors potentially that will turn around and say something to the effect of, yeah, well, that's one video, etc. And, you know, there was plenty of time that happened between then and the actual referendum and perhaps when the promise was made. Okay, well, what about all the videos that I have after that referendum, but prior to the 2016 referendum, where she never made any reference to that whatsoever?
Of course, the big risk, in my view, to Scotland's continuing relationship with the European Union and continuing membership of the European Union is not the prospect of Scottish independence, but it is the prospect of an in-out referendum promised by the UK government. So the message that I'll be delivering here in Brussels today is very much a positive one. We are and want to continue to be a constructive part of Europe, contributing to and influencing all of the big policy agendas. But we want to do that.
All the big policy agendas. Some things never change. She had aspirations back then, and my God, those aspirations have grown as time has persisted.
As an independent member state, because that gives us the ability to assert and protect and articulate our vital national interests.
She's so full of fucking shit. This is all about her, nothing to do with us at all. I just want to put it on record, like, I know many people, myself included obviously, that voted for independence knowing damn well that we wouldn't be going back into the EU, or at the very least we would have to reapply. And she eventually would come to that knowledge herself, where the EU eventually, as I said, came out and had to say that we would have to reapply. So all this, oh please let's stay, please, oh let's stay, routine fell on deaf ears essentially. So naturally David Cameron inevitably did get elected. So again, this was all common knowledge, we knew that this was in the pipeline potentially. It seems more to me that she was more concerned about the European Union. She was more obsessed with the idea that us leaving the UK via independence, with Spain potentially vetoing and us having to go through the process of having to reapply, etc. It seems more that that was playing on her mind as opposed to the electorate. But anyway, the vote came and it was 45-55 obviously. And I do believe it was rigged. But I don't believe it was rigged by the same people that the SNP fanboys will have you believe it was rigged by. I believe it was rigged by the SNP themselves. And the reason I believe it was rigged by the SNP is because they knew that... A laptop deprived of charge almost put me off my stride there. But again, I believe that they rigged it because they knew themselves that there was a possibility that the referendum could in fact go the way that they intended it or pretended they wished it to go, aka a win, an independence win. But then that would also lead to a potential fuck you from Spain, and we wouldn't get into the EU. So we would have been out of the UK and out of the EU. And then what would we do? Well, God forbid, we went alone. We went it alone, you know, like... you would have thought they would have wanted to do, but nah, because it's not about that. It never was. And I'm not saying this was all the SNPs doing themselves. This could have been a whole establishment game, but the SNP knew about it, as far as I'm concerned. Proofs in the pudding, in terms of the fact that the elections that came after the fact, the SNP support surged. Simultaneously, of course, Labour's support in Scotland plummeted, but the SNP support surged and it never really dropped. You don't go from losing quite comfortably a referendum to then in turn winning 2 back-to-back elections with quote-unquote landslide victories. It just doesn't work like that as far as I'm concerned. That doesn't add up mathematically. Clearly indicating that something wasn't right. Also indicating that the people that were voting to give them these landslide victories back-to-back were voting with independence in mind. Or at least somewhere. Again, something I'll come on to. So now we come to some of the videos that I've got of 2015, 2016 time, prior to the EU referendum, but obviously after the 2014 referendum. And Nicola Tinlips never makes one reference to the promise that was made in 2014. That big bad promise, obviously, that the only way to stay in the EU was to vote to remain in the UK. You know, that promise that she starts to revise in 2018, 2019 time and gets her party members to do the same thing. Yeah, it's funny and very strange how that never actually gets mentioned during these videos. Very, very strange that's nonetheless.
Can act in isolation, whether as part of the UK or as an independent country. We know that partnership is essential for progress. And so the fundamental vision of the EU, of independent nations working together for a common good, appeals to us. And some of the concerns which often get raised about Europe in the UK media, especially about sovereignty, possibly carry less weight in Scotland. After all, Scotland has been pooling sovereignty in one form or another for many years. We've always been a nation that has looked outwards to the rest of the UK, to Europe and to the wider world. And it's worth noting that this would have remained the case even if Scotland had voted last year to become an independent country. There's absolutely nothing contradictory about independent countries recognising their interdependence and choosing to pool some sovereignty for mutual advantage. On the contrary, that is the way of the modern world.
So, in that clip there, 2 references were made to the idea that we can't act in isolation, and it's the way of the modern world where you all have to come together and pool some sovereignty, etc, etc. So it kind of gives a bit of credence to the idea that she, or the SNP in general, just couldn't make that risk in terms of allowing the referendum of 2014 to go in favour of a win, just on the off chance that they ended up being in that position where they would be in quote-unquote isolation. But again, I'd like for somebody at some point to push back on these ideas. I mean, why can't you act in isolation? Why can't you go it alone and just have measly little trade deals? Why do you have to be part of a bigger organisation, a bigger entity? Why? Never gets answered. It's just professed to be a good thing, apparently. Nonetheless, no reference, as I said, to the promises made in 2014, of course.
And that's one of the reasons that the independence referendum last year, and this is a credit to both sides in that referendum, was such a peaceful, inclusive and democratic debate. And it's also perhaps why nobody really in that referendum argued about whether Scotland should be a member of the EU. The debate on both sides was about how best we could continue to play our part. In fact, the ability to participate more fully in international bodies such as the European Union appealed to many of us on the yes side of that debate as an additional positive reason to seek national independence.
Oh, so let me get this straight, as she just said there. The idea of us playing our part and having more to do within the EU appealed to the people on the yes side. It appealed to them because, we'll get our independence, join the EU, and we'll be able to play our part and do more. It's a very strange thing to say from a woman who a few years later makes the claim that the only way we could ever stay in Europe was if we voted to remain in the UK. Very, very bizarre, that. Very strange. I'm just saying.
Clubs across Scotland. In 10 days' time, its citizens will vote on whether to become an independent country. A yes would have huge implications for Edinburgh's future relationship with the EU. Earlier this year, European Commission President José Manuel Barroso handed a boost to British Prime Minister David Cameron, who backs the No campaign. Barroso said in an interview in February with British television that Scotland would have to reapply to join the EU.
This position that has not changed is on the record. It is not our role 10 days before the vote to interfere in the campaign with new statements that will be taken up partly here and there.
Scottish First Minister Alex Salmond insists that an independent Scotland would remain inside the EU. Viviane Pertisseau of the French Institute of International Relations disagrees.
It will have to apply to membership, so it will have to ask the council to vote on a potential membership. The bigger risk is if Scotland arrives with a lot of demands. If it applies to the EU, we don't want the euro, we don't want to be part of Schengen. That's going to be extremely difficult for Scotland to have all those opt-outs that it's been enjoying as a UK member.
Brussels today making the case for Scotland and the UK remaining part of the European Union. Yes, there is a case for reform. I want to see a European Union that doesn't interfere in matters that are best left to the discretion of national governments. I want to see more proportionate regulation and more democracy and transparency. But fundamentally, I believe that Scotland and the UK's best interests are served by being a member of the European Union. Jobs depend on it, investment depends on it. The diversity of our country and the sense of who we are, I think, depends on it. And that's
sense of who we are. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a fantastic one. But that's dick lifted lips over the back, is it not? Sense of who we are. The SNP, of course, they're on Twitter account. As cringe as it gets. Their location. It says Scotland, Europe. Geographically incorrect. Literally. But, what do I know? I'm not a cringy dickhead like her, but I'm not saying it was her that did that, but you can more or less believe it was. Sort of thing that she would do but you know, it's who we are. Are you making reference to the fact that we're all part of the European people? We're all of the one race? Is that where you're going with this, Thin Lips? No, of course not. You're going with the concept of this family of nations bullshit. Strange how the SNP of old, when it was still the EEC, when the opportunity arose for a referendum all the way back then, to decide whether or not to remain in it or to leave. They were making claims that the future of the EEC threatened the identity, if I'm not mistaken, if that might have been how it was worded. It threatened the national identity or the culture of Scotland. Right to self-determine, or words to that effect. Fast forward to the present day, after all their concerns were essentially quashed and forgotten about, and we have Thin Lips throwing it all back in her face and saying the polar opposite. It's who we are. Is that right? That's maybe who you think we are, but you don't speak for me. You never fucking have. That is the problem with this Thin Lip boot. She speaks for herself, but she channels it through this bullshit that she's speaking on behalf of the people in the country. No, you're projecting. You're speaking for yourself. Because one thing that I have become relatively convinced of as the years have gone by is that this is one very vindictive, power-hungry woman. Manipulation is her strategy, and it's her specialty. And as the years go on, she seems to get better at it. But even back then, it's kind of obvious. It's who we are. Oh shit. You know, it comes across as just your proverbial wet wipe routine from a proverbial lefty, you know? And maybe you're right if you think that way. Who am I to judge you? I'm just giving my 2 cents since I'm enjoying this trip down memory lane. It all started, bear in mind, because I got pissed off having to relive those moments with Michael Russell under his blue umbrella, you know? I could have calmed down by watching some Alan Smith or maybe potentially some Angus Robertson, but I don't think I can take any more of his gay antics in Parliament. Anyway.
Case I'll be making. The UK is not a unitary state, it's a multinational state, and I think it would be wrong for any one member of that multinational family of nations to be taken out of the European Union against its will. So I will argue for what's called a double majority rule that would mean that the UK could only come out of the European Union if each of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to do so.
And you think that she was doing this for everybody in the UK? Really? No, she was doing this for herself. She would make the argument she was doing it for Scotland, but she doesn't speak for everybody in Scotland. So is she doing it for her voter base, or is she doing it for her party, herself, and her puppet masters? All of the above? Who knows for certain? But one thing is abundantly clear. She was not doing this for the benefit of the whole of the UK. She was doing this for self-centred reasons. But the takeaway from that, of course, is this is one of 2 clips that I found of her acknowledging or telling you that she had this little plan put into place to try and fuck up the vote prior to it occurring. So even before the EU referendum had come to be, she had put things, or tried to put things in place to fuck it up. Trying to put it in place that every country had to vote the same way in order for the vote to be respected. And naturally, her argument to that is that the main promise of 2014, actually, it wasn't nothing to do with having to stay in the UK to stay in the EU. No. It was all about equal partners, or words to that effect. She'll reiterate it at some point. She might have a point, you know, in that regard. But at the same time, it's a referendum. It's it's the UK. It's essentially one giant nation, whether we like it or not. And with that in mind, stands to reason that it would be relative, or irrelevant, I should say, how one area of said landmass voted in a referendum that encompassed all of it.
MP, we're the government in Scotland in the devolved parliament, and we've been the government for 8 years, and we've kept most of our promises. We've done really good things for Scotland, and in each election we seem to get more popular, so we'll keep...
Yeah. Of course, this is 2015, so 2014's referendum has come and gone, where the SNP in that election had won 56 out of 59 seats. So that was blatantly got some capacity. There's some link to the referendum that was just less than a year prior. They lose a referendum by 10 points, 45-55. Then they win a landslide victory in an election the year after. Come on now. Come on. So,
dream of that self-determination. Would you still be a part of UK? Would you be a part of the European Union? What would you want to do?
Yes, we'd be part of the European Union. Okay. And one of the really worrying things just now is David Cameron might be about to take the UK out of the European Union. That would be devastating for Scotland and for the UK. So,
and again, does she make any reference at this point in time to the alleged promise that was made in order for us to vote to stay in the UK to begin with? No, she fucking doesn't. No, she doesn't.
We want to be part of the European Union. And if Scotland became independent, we wouldn't be part of the United Kingdom anymore, but we'd still be part of the British Isles. So Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland, we're a family of nations, and we can be a family of nations even if Scotland is independent. You know, my grandmother was English.
Riveting stuff. Riveting stuff.
As we shift uncomfortably in our seat.
Let me ask you first of all about something that we referenced.
This was around about the September of 2015, so a couple of months had gone by since the election, and her support, or the SNP support, was still increasing in the polls. So it's just interesting to know what gets said here.
And we know we're going to have, which is the referendum on European Union membership. How will that change the dynamic of politics in Scotland?
Well, obviously, it depends on the outcome of it. I will be passionately arguing in that referendum that not just Scotland, but the UK should opt to stay within the European Union, not because I think it's perfect. I don't. I think there's many aspects of it that are ripe for reform, but I think our interests are best served by being within. If we end up in the scenario, which might not happen, but it is certainly not beyond the bounds of possibility, that the UK as a whole voted to come out of the European Union, but Scotland voted to stay in.
Now, naturally, she was quite close to her. Well, that hypothesis she put forth there was relatively similar to what ended up happening in the end result. No, obviously the only difference being that Northern Ireland as well voted to remain if we're going to go down that route. But very strange that she goes to that example first and foremost. That she just automatically seems to assume as if she's got some sort of know-how. Or at the very bare minimum, she seems to be hella convinced that the entirety of Scotland, or enough people in Scotland, are in support of the EU. I mean, that wasn't the sort of reception that I was receiving when I was wondering about. That wasn't the sort of conversations I was having. There was a lot of talk of independence. Obviously, it was dying out a bit as the referendum had been and gone. There was a bit of acceptance starting to emerge that there wasn't going to be another one. But obviously, simultaneously, the SNP support was still on the rise because of a lot of people being convinced that there was tomfoolery at play. I didn't really hear very much chatter at the time about EU support, so how she has managed at this point in time to come up with that hypothesis out of fucking thin air, nonetheless, that's not really the point I want to focus on too much here. It's what she then says.
I think that would undoubtedly have people in Scotland demanding that we look again at whether we should be independent.
And it's very convenient that that's exactly what you ended up enshrining into your mandate.
I've said that before, and I don't think there's any doubt that there would be an appetite in those circumstances to look again at the independence question.
And throughout all of this, by the way, throughout this whole time period, she tried her damnedest to ignore the elephant in the room, which was that the surge in support that she'd managed to obtain was mainly, if not completely, derived from independent supporters. But she sits there and she says, oh, if that happened, then I would see an appetite emerging. No, there's an appetite now. It's got real fuck all to do with the EU.
Make the independence proposition very different, wouldn't it? Because then there really would be a border.
It would also make the staying in the UK proposition very different as well. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I think it would make a vote for independence guaranteed or inevitable. I'm sure there would be a variety of different opinions at that time. What I am saying, though, is I think it would. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it would have many people saying that that is an option we should at least look at again. Incidentally, I've put forward a proposal that would take away the possibility of this scenario arising, this idea that many federal states, and I know we're not a federal country in the UK, but nevertheless an idea that many federal states embrace of double majority, so that for a UK exit, for a Brexit, there would have to be not just a vote across the entirety of the UK, but a vote for that in each of the component nations of the UK. because we were told repeatedly during the referendum that the UK is a family of equal nations. Now, if that's true, then here's a chance to prove it.
Right? It's very interesting when you consider the fact that Nicola Thinlips at that point in time was still advocating for putting something in place that would have prevented the event of Scotland potentially voting to remain, whereas the rest of the UK didn't. You know, again, this was more about EU membership as opposed to trying to find crafty little ways to obtain a mandate. Because a lot of her supporters at the time, a lot of activists at the time, believed that that was what the SNP were doing. There was some sort of sneaky little game in the background in order to try their damnedest to obtain a referendum as quick as possible. Well, already, before we even reached the EU referendum, she's already trying to put hurdles in the way to prevent that from occurring. Not the actions of somebody that would want a referendum. Surely no. You know, the big brain isn't ticking yet.
Spend a lot of time over the next couple of years arguing very strongly for the UK as a whole to vote to stay in the European Union. Because maybe this is one of my faults. I'm not one of these constantly, Machiavellian sort of type politicians that, is always trying to engineer certain scenarios that suit my political purposes, even if I think they're bad for the country.
Well, you could have fooled me, Nicola Thinlips, because from what I've been observing as a bystander for years, you and your party, that's exactly what you fucking are. And even trying to put things in place to essentially scupper the vote before it's even taken place. You're doing that for yourself, you're doing that for your party, you're doing that for your string pullers, you're not doing that for the average Scot, nor the average Brit for that matter. You're doing that for self-centered reasons or personal reasons that we're probably not even privy to. But I love that she tries to distance herself from the exact thing that she fucking is. And that becomes ever more apparent, especially in the events that took place after the EU referendum, such as the video that, spurred on this little trip down memory lane. Not the Blue Umbrella Man, but, the bullshitting in Parliament, revising history. Because again, did she mention at all at any point during that little segment there, that little exchange, anything to do with a promise to remain in the EU? The only way to remain in the EU was to stay in the UK. Did she mention that? No, she fucking didn't. Because it didn't take place. It's bullshit. She's lying. She lied. Oh, go fucking figure.
I hope there is a vote in Scotland and across the UK to stay within the European Union. I'll continue to argue the case for Scotland to be an independent country.
Yeah, you say that to pacify your voters.
In that context, but I'll argue that case in the upcoming referendum.
Going on in the SNP about how the next time you pose this question, whether it's in the course of the next Holyrood Parliament or beyond, about how the case for independence would have to change. To win it?
A considerable amount, which is not to say we're currently planning for a second referendum, but it would be strange, would it not, to have just gone through the referendum we've just gone through, and to narrowly fail to win it, but to make considerable progress towards that. I mean, at the start of the referendum campaign, support for independence in polls rarely got above maybe 30%, a third of the vote. Now, to get to 45%, which was not as far as I wanted us to get and hoped we would get, and in the latter stages of the campaign believed we would get, but it was still a considerable distance to have travelled, which suggested that the Yes campaign actually persuaded, in the course of that campaign, significant numbers of people in Scotland.
And the fact that the election that came less than a year later gave you a landslide victory would suggest that there's a possible argument to be had that there was tomfoolery at play in the actual referendum itself. Who would that benefit? Well, you could make the argument it would benefit the UK, but it would also benefit the SNP themselves.
It would be strange to have come out of that campaign falling just short, not to be thinking very carefully and in a very reflective way about the things that we might have done better or would have to address differently in future. I'm not going to share all of that with you today.
Even some of it.
Well, I think, centrally to that, and this will bring in a lot of different issues to it, but ultimately, now, don't get me wrong, many people who voted no because they passionately and in principle believed in the United Kingdom, and I respect that. So there are a number of people that we would never have been able to convince because their belief in the UK was as strong as my belief in independence, and that is absolutely legitimate. But there were a lot of people, and I know many of them personally, who in their hearts wanted to vote yes, many of them who perhaps went into the polling station planning to vote yes, but in their heads weren't quite there and couldn't bring themselves to do it. Now, why was that? In a nutshell, that was because they were, call it frightened, worried, concerned, anxious about the implications, particularly economic implications. Now, a whole lot of things would have come into play there, from currency to European Union membership to the fiscal position of Scotland. But what we have to find ways of overcoming is that concern and anxiety, and that will embrace a whole variety of issues in it.
And just to finish off that little point there, so she even has the opportunity right there in front of the crowds, to explain why people voted the way that they did, why they didn't vote to leave the UK. And at no point does she make any reference to the so-called promises that were made regarding the only way to stay in the EU was to vote to stay in the UK. No, the only way to stay in the EU was to vote to stay in the UK. She had the perfect opportunity. Very strange. Very fucking strange, that, is it not? So the 2016 election came round, of course, and that led to the SNP winning again, and that led them to have a total of 63 seats, as they won 59 in the actual election itself. So, with that in mind, that brings us to the referendum. The 2 election wins back-to-back that gave Nicola Dunlop's landslide victories quite clearly a response to the referendum results of 2014. So naturally, there's at least in part, bulk of independent supporters, fresh, brand new independent supporters, ready and waiting. So Nicola Sturgeon's trick up her sleeve was to include within the mandate of 2016 that if, in the event that Scotland happened to vote to remain in the EU and the UK voted to leave, they would have a mandate in order for them to then push for independence. So to the SNP supporters that voted for her because they want a referendum, this was quite clearly the easiest way to get what they want as quickly as possible. All vote accordingly. But just for anybody that wasn't up to scratch, or for anybody that wasn't aware, anybody that hadn't read the manifesto, or just a quick refresher before the referendum itself, as the title of this video was Why Independent Supporters Should Vote to Remain in the EU this Thursday. So the referendum was just days away. So Nicola Sturgeon came out to address the people that gave her the back-to-back landslide victory wins. And again, just to stress one more time, the bulk of which, at least, or in parts, were independent supporters. So let that sink in.
Independent supporters frequently ask me 2 questions about the EU referendum. The first is, how can you support independence and back Scotland's membership of the EU? Well, the answer to that is simple. I believe that independent countries must cooperate to tackle common challenges. Every member of the EU is an independent country working with others for the greater good. The second question is whether a Brexit vote will mean a second independence referendum. Well, here's what the SNP manifesto at the recent election said about that. The Scottish...
And the fact that she has to come out specifically to address people that might be thinking about an independence referendum. Yeah, that's what this video is about. That's who it's addressed to. So here's what the Scottish manifesto said about that.
Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the European Union against our will. Now, I'm clear that if Scotland does indeed face that prospect of being taken out of Europe against our will, then that option is on the table. But to be clear, that situation only arises if Scotland votes remain next week. If Scotland votes to leave, then that premise for independence doesn't arise.
So she's telling all of her independent supporters that if Scotland votes to leave the European Union, then the premise for an independence referendum doesn't arise. It's very strange if you ask me. You would think that in the event of the UK leaving the EU, that would give her the ammunition that she could require in the future in order to justify another referendum. I mean, think about it. Oh, the isolationism, etc. And when people in Scotland start to realise that it's a hellscape, surely that would drum up the support that she would need. But no. But anyway, the point is, though, that she specifically went out of her way to tell her independent supporters that voting to leave the European Union would render the idea of an independence referendum, or a second one anyway, null and void. So they had to vote to remain. But that works in her favour twofold. Because on the one hand, it obtains the mandate, naturally, which is the backup clause if all else fails. But second of all, it helps to boost up the overall Remain, UK-wide Remain votes, because naturally a good portion of SNP supporters will have voted accordingly, thinking that this was some form of tactical voting. Now, unbeknownst to them, of course, they're just being duped, because all this boot was doing was ensuring, or trying her damnedest anyway, to get as many people to vote Remain as possible. Why else would she fucking essentially say to them that, oh, I know you might have voted for me because you want independence, but you're not going to get it if you vote Leave, so you have to vote Remain. And naturally, of course, it looks to these people as if, oh, this is all about securing that cheeky little mandate. But what would have happened if the UK had voted to Remain? The independence dream would have disappeared. She would have been satisfied. And that would have been the end of the conversation. So, unless you people that voted the way that she told you to, were completely convinced that the UK was actually going to vote to leave, then this was a gamble. But it was a gamble that would have paid off for her regardless. Unless, of course, the UK actually voted to leave. And so did Scotland. But by exploiting independent supporters and exploiting what she knew they wanted, it was quite clear to her, at the very bare minimum, that Scotland wasn't going to vote to leave. That wasn't going to occur. Because she's simultaneously managing to tie in EU supporters alongside independent supporters, so that sort of would have inflated the vote. And of course it did inflate the vote, because naturally Scotland inevitably voted, what was it, 62% to Remain? But that was a figure she ran with ever since. The minute that fucking figure dropped, she ran with it. She ran with it for all it was worth. And to the independent supporters, it looked as if she was simply carrying out their wishes or defending the democracy that occurred in Scotland. When the reality of the matter was, as I've said so many times, as it became so apparent to me, all that was occurring here is that these individuals, their vote, these are the people in general, they were just being scapegoated because this was about her and what she fucking wanted.
But if you're basing your decision on what it means for independence, let me be very, very clear. The only sensible and logical vote is one for Scotland to remain in Europe. If Scotland votes to leave, then our immediate future will be one inside the UK but outside the EU, at the mercy of a Tory government led by the likes of Boris Johnson, which is even more right-wing than that of David Cameron and George Osborne. So I ask you to vote Remain on Thursday, because it is in Scotland's best interest.
First Minister, you say you want Scotland to remain in the EU. You say that to do that you're likely to propose a referendum. The rest of the UK will be out of the EU. That must mean there will be a border between Scotland, a proper, real border between Scotland and England.
These are issues that we now have to assess and consider, and we have to do that calmly and rationally. That's why I have said very, very clearly in the remarks I've made today that I am not going to stand here and pretend to anybody that the issues we face are straightforward. We face many complex issues, which is another reason why, in addition to being determined about giving effect to how Scotland voted, I'm going to take the time to make sure that all of Scotland considers all of these issues and has the chance to move forward as one. I think that is of the utmost importance at this time.
You see there the little insert of how Scotland voted. Yeah, and why did they vote that way? At least in part. You know, I could meet anybody halfway and say that maybe half of the votes that the SNP, or should I say, half of the Remain vote in Scotland was obtained via Nicola Dunlop's directing her independent supporters to vote a specific way. But that's still half. But you're not telling me that thought process wasn't going through her mind. You're not telling me that it wasn't going through her mind at least once or twice that she played a role in the vote going the way that it did. But she stands there as if she's so fucking two-faced, which she in many respects is, because this is divisive as fuck. Which is pretty applaudable or laudable, I guess you could say, in regards to politicians. As far as politicians go, it's rather clever, callous, but that's how you have to be in politics, I presume, puppet or not. But as a bystander witnessing it, no, I just think it's fucking malevolent, very malevolent. As she stands there and she tries to play this innocent little routine. She wants to bring everybody in Scotland together, and even the people that didn't vote the way that vote the way of Remain, get everybody to come together and understand the circumstances, etc., etc. And the narrative that she wanted to sort of perpetuate at the time was that Scotland's always ignored, etc., etc. Naturally, it's supposed to sort of get the two ducks working a bit, get everybody to feel sorry for Nicola Dunlops and the SNP and the poor little Remainers. You know. Anyway.
First Minister, are you confident that in the potential turmoil that could follow a Brexit, that those are circumstances in which Scotland will want to vote for independence?
I think in the circumstances of turmoil, and can I say I don't want to see turmoil affecting any part of the United Kingdom. I believe the decision that was taken across the UK yesterday was the wrong decision, a mistake. But I hope very much that some of the fears that were had about it are not realised, because it would not be in the interests of people anywhere in the UK if they are. But I'm not sure that is not more in hope than in expectation. But it is exactly because of the uncertainty and the potential turmoil that we face that I think it is in my responsibility to seek to bring Scotland together, to lead Scotland forward into a position that allows us to continue with the stability and the certainty that membership of the European Union gives us. I am not saying that these issues are straightforward, but I do think that is the responsibility and indeed the opportunity that now lies before us. But I'll take...
So bold, so brave.
For the vast majority of voters in Scotland who voted to remain within the European Union. Flesh out for us the process by which you think the EU may be able to offer Scotland a way to stay within the EU without actually having to leave, hold an independence referendum and then rejoin.
Well, I don't know that that will be possible. What I'm determined to do is explore all possible options to give effect to how people in Scotland voted and to protect Scotland's interests, to avoid us being taken out of the European Union against our will with all of the deeply damaging and painful...
Against our will, you know, this was the routine, this was repeated over and over again. Every interview that took place, we were reminded constantly of being taken out of Europe against our will. No reference at all. Why would you, of course? No reference to how that vote could have potentially gone the way that it did, you know. If you vote to leave, then you won't see an independence referendum. So naturally, things look quite good for the independent supporters and the people that voted accordingly at this point in time, because it looks as if everything's working down to a T. It really does look, it appears as if Nicola Dunlop's has obtained a mandate that she secretly always wanted, apparently, allegedly. And these people have no idea that this is all just a fucking front. Naturally, if she could get a referendum, fine, hunky-dory. But the reality of the matter is this is about the EU first and foremost. This has got fuck all to do with a referendum in order to obtain independence. She could LARP all day long about wanting independence and apparently being a lifelong independent supporter. But fundamentally, this is about EU membership, EU status, above all else.
That will entail. So that's my guiding principle to protect Scotland's interests. I'm not starting from the premise of saying it's got to be independence. I'm starting from the premise of what do we need to do to protect Scotland's interests. But if it does appear to be obvious that the only way we can protect Scotland's interests is by looking again at independence, then that's an option that Scotland has to have. And of course, a second independence referendum in these circumstances would not just be a rerun of the 2014 one, because the context has completely changed. The UK that we voted to remain within in 2014 doesn't exist anymore. And of course, what many people saw as the stability of the UK versus the unknown of independence in 2014 is completely different. What we know for sure is that the UK faces real uncertainty and deeply damaging economic consequences of a Brexit. So independence may be the best option of securing stability for Scotland, and that's an option that we must have the right to consider. Spoke clearly and positively for the European Union. We opted to remain members of the European Union in the votes that Scotland cast last week. Since I've been here today, I've found enormous interest in the referendum result, as you would expect, and I've also had a sympathetic response to the position Scotland now finds itself in, facing
Which, of course, transpired, at least in part, because of what she specifically directed her voters to do. So it's always interesting to take note of that fact. But she wants to portray this little narrative to the world, to the whole world, to all who will listen. Poor little Scotland and poor little Nicola Dunlops are potentially end up in deep water, deep uncharted waters for something they didn't even vote for in the first place. And of course, even at this point, it looks as if everything's going exactly to plan to the people that voted accordingly for the little tactical voting.
Was one British leader in Brussels today as the SNP's Nicola Sturgeon toured the Parliament and the Commission on a simple mission.
I'm here to protect Scotland's place in Europe.
At this stage, it doesn't seem Brussels can do much for her beyond laying the groundwork for a future relationship.
Is it realistic that you can actually stay in, or is it just getting a better deal for Scotland when the UK leaves?
Look, Scotland voted to stay in, and as First Minister, I've got a duty to seek to give effect to what people in Scotland voted for. So look, I don't...
How convenient. They voted exactly the way that you wanted them to vote. And it just so happens you told them to vote that way to begin with by dangling an independence referendum carrot in front of their fucking face. It's funny how that all seems to work. Yes. But again, showcasing how she's managing to essentially scapegoat these people, because this is all about her. You know, the Scottish people didn't send her to Brussels to try and formulate some form of relationship, grovel, etc. And she did that of her own accords. You know. But nonetheless, but as 2017 came around, the narrative had somewhat changed. Nicola Dunlop's had decided to embark on the soft Brexit routine. The same with quite a lot of other politicians, but the SNP were relatively prominent at it. Nicola Dunlop's been one of the first and also one of the most consistent. But 2017 rolled around. Surprise, surprise, no fucking referendum. And here she is, yet again at a conference, still making or referring to the plight that Scotland finds itself in. People, of course, are still waiting for this referendum. Some are, anyway.
Friends, it is great to see so many of you here today. But I hope you will forgive me, because my speech this afternoon is not really aimed at you. Of course, I could be going out on a limb here, but I'm assuming I already have your support. I'm assuming that you need no persuading that Scotland should not be dragged out of Europe by a Tory government intent on a disastrous, hard Brexit.
A hard Brexit, of course, was their redefining of Brexit. That's what it was meant to be. You leave. Now, naturally, it was down to reason that you would formulate some form of trade deal, but the soft Brexit that they were all suggesting, as opposed to a hard Brexit, would essentially have left us in the EU, so you would have left in name only. That's what they were trying to argue for. So Nicola Sturgeon had gone from insisting that there was going to be an imminent referendum in 2016. The narrative, the pendulum somewhat changed, and she decided to take the position of trying to thwart Brexit, or fuck it up, or, try and advocate and argue for a soft Brexit. While simultaneously still, dangling that carrot to her independent supporters who are still waiting in the background patiently. Those people, of course, that voted the way that she told them to vote in order to obtain the 62% Remain vote for Scotland in the first place, which gave her the leverage to stand there and spout off shit.
And I'm guessing that you're already convinced that Scotland has what it takes to join the family of independent nations.
So we're already at the point. Well, there's no secret anyway, but they're quite guilty of it. But just automatically assuming that independence instantaneously means EU membership or the road to EU membership. She's morphing them into one, making them indistinguishable, despite the fact they're two separate issues completely. And again, because this is not about independence, it never fucking was, because independence without EU membership means fuck all to Nicola Sturgeon with her hair gel, literal hair gel in this time, and the SNP in general.
Well, that's a relief. Friends, our job is not to talk to each other. It is to reach out to those not persuaded, to put ourselves in their shoes, to understand the hopes, fears and ambitions of all our fellow citizens, and to do what we can to establish common ground. Always remember Bashir's words. Carry them with you in your heart. What matters is where we are going together. These words don't just apply to how we treat those who come from other countries. They must apply to how we treat each other. All of us who live here and call Scotland home. We all want the best for our country. We just have different views on how to achieve it. As Scotland's government, we bear a special responsibility to offer a hand across these differences, to build consensus where we can. So let us resolve to argue our case with passion and commitment, yes, but at all times with courtesy, understanding and respect.
So as 2017 rolled around, Nicola Dunlop decides it's now time to come out and talk about the independence referendum of the future. This is what all of her fan base has been waiting for, so she announces it proudly.
The problem with doing nothing now is that by the time these fears are realised, it will be too late for Scotland to choose a different path before the damage is done. That would not be right or fair. Whatever path we take, it should be one decided by us, not for us. So let me set out the plan I intend to pursue. First, I will continue to stand up for Scotland's interest during the process of Brexit negotiations. Second, I will now take the steps necessary to make sure that Scotland will have a choice at the end of this process. A choice of whether to follow the UK to a hard Brexit or to become an independent country, able to secure a real partnership of equals with the rest of the UK and our own relationship with Europe. The Scottish Government's mandate for offering this choice is beyond doubt. Last year, we were elected with the highest share of the constituency vote won by any party in the history of devolution on a manifesto that said this: the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. These conditions have, of course, now been met. So I can confirm today that next week I will seek the authority of the Scottish Parliament to agree with the UK Government the details of a Section 30 order, the procedure that will enable the Scottish Parliament to legislate for an independence referendum.
There was the resurgent Tory vote, 12 Scottish seats, shoring up a troubled party down south. And there was Scottish independence, the issue that turned on its axis overnight. Alex Salmond was a high-profile casualty of a voters' reaction against a second referendum. So too another SNP big hitter, Deputy Leader Angus Robertson.
Hi there.
Their party leader had laid out referendum plans only weeks ago. Nicola Sturgeon acknowledged it had been a factor in the loss of 21 seats. Has she now lost all prospect of independence with it?
Look, I accept that independence and an independence referendum was a factor. We cannot escape the presence of the constitutional question in Scottish politics, even if we wanted to. So that, I think, is the case. I also, as I've said in response to others, I think there were other factors at play in the election yesterday as well, and we will take time to consider them fully.
This is my new MP! Yeah!
Scottish Labour were up from 1 to 7 seats, and the Liberal Democrats from 1 to 4 in Scotland. Like the Conservatives, both benefited from anti-independence sentiment, and all say the idea of a referendum should be taken off the table.
Scotland's First Minister has been cautious in her Brexit strategy recently, saying she'd wait for the terms to be clear before showing her hand. But today, for the first time, Nicola Sturgeon gave her party's support to a second Brexit referendum.
I've said before we would not stand in the way of a second referendum, the so-called people's vote. I think the SNP MPs would undoubtedly vote for
they would.
that
That's
proposition.
very important.
She also confirmed the SNP will vote against Theresa May's Brexit plan.
Well, we've always said our bottom line is membership of the single market and the customs union. I cannot envisage the SNP MPs voting for something that doesn't contain that.
At the first day of...
Now, of course, all the SNP or Thin Lips would have done would have been to have voted for every single one of these, or one off, I should say, these admittedly shit proposals that Theresa May put forth. Her crappy deals. All it would take is for one of these to be voted upon. Thus, you would enter the exiting process from the European Union in theory, thus activating the SNP's mandate. Thus they have the legal legitimacy to hold a referendum via the mandate they obtained in 2016. But instead, Nicola Dunlop would prefer to not only campaign on and off for a people's vote, quote unquote, aka a second Brexit referendum, or EU referendum, whatever you will, but simultaneously refuse to vote for the very thing that would allow her to act upon her mandate. Instead, trying to push for the soft Brexit routine of staying in the single market and customs union, etc., etc., effectively leaving the EU in name only.
Their conference, the SNP's focus is on Brexit, perhaps because new polls out today hint that it makes Scottish independence more likely. There is no great schism in the SNP over Brexit. Unlike the Conservatives and Labour, this party is impressively unified, but there is a growing restlessness because many here would love a chance to vote for independence again, to come out of the UK before, as they see it, they are dragged out of the EU against their will.
Yeah, many of these people, of course, voted or want independence because, you know, that's what they voted for, or voted in the EU referendum for accordingly. But that's here nor there, I guess.
Else now, just playing for time, running down the clock. With every day that passes, no deal becomes a risk, and that's not acceptable. Well, I'm going to first and foremost meet with my own group to look at the options, to talk to them about how we can best use our position in the House of Commons to move things in the right direction. While I'm there, I'm happy to speak to anybody in the opposition to try to bring together a consensus about the way forward. Now, we have, of course, the vote of no confidence, the debate on that tomorrow. I really do hope that the House of Commons decides to kick this government out, and the SNP will be part of that. But if it doesn't, I think the pressure then is on Jeremy Corbyn and Labour to make its position on a second referendum clear. Well, it's in Scotland's interest, whatever the constitutional status of Scotland might be in the future, and obviously I hope that is as an independent country, will always be in our interest for the rest of the UK to be, you know, stable and in the EU. And that's why I've always said that we would play our part in trying to keep the whole UK in the EU, or at the very least in the single market and customs union. Of course, Scotland didn't vote to leave the first time round. And what...
On, again. Wonder how that vote came to be.
Is ultimately most important to me is protecting Scotland's interests and making sure that Scotland's voice is respected. Rush into an immediate decision before a Brexit path has been determined would not allow for an informed choice to be made. However, if we are to safeguard Scotland's interests, we cannot wait indefinitely. That is why I consider that a choice between Brexit and a future for Scotland as an independent European nation should be offered in the lifetime of this Parliament.
May I also add in as well here that the fact that she's continuously blurring the lines between independence and EU membership, making them one and the same, yet simultaneously cries and whines and moans through her fat, thin-lipped fucking face about democracy or lack thereof. Remarkable. Really fucking remarkable. What about the people in Scotland that might have voted for independence but don't want to be part of the EU? Do they not get a say? Do they not get a seat at the table? Do they not get listened to? Do they not get taken into consideration? Or do they not matter? Do the only people that matter to this thin-lipped fucking arsehole are the only people that matter to her the ones that vote accordingly, listen to her every word? They're not synonymous.
Scotland is taken out of the EU. The option of a referendum on independence within that timescale must be open to us. That would be our route to avoiding the worst of the damage Brexit will do.
But if we're not taken out, there would be no referendum, and you would shut up. Thus again proving the point that this was always about EU membership as opposed to independence. And I am very cautious of the time at this point, fuck's sake. That's 2019. I guess, in summary, I could just conclude with the
COVID crisis, you would table the legislation for a referendum on independence. When are you going to do that?
The preparatory work of that is underway right now. We haven't decided on the date that we would seek to introduce the bill. We will decide that in the coming weeks. But what I have said, and I will happily say again to you right now, that my intention is to take the steps that will facilitate a referendum happening before the end of 2023. That's the proposition that just short of a year ago I fought an election on and was re-elected as First Minister. My party was re-elected with a historically high share of the vote. This is about democracy.
Democracy. This is about democracy, she says. You know, bear in mind, it was a minority government, but you know, this is about democracy. So this is now post-COVID or post-Koof, if you will. So, and here she is, proudly announcing that. No, sorry, is this? Wait, this was prior to COVID. I can't even fucking remember. I've been staring at too many elections and dates and whatnot all night. No, this was the 2019 election that got her in. So we're back to square one now, essentially. Because obviously the 2019 election, she made the promise that there would be a referendum in 2020. came out in January to tell the public that there would not be a referendum potentially. It would, might have to wait till 2021, despite the fact she spent the entire campaign driving about in her fucking bus in 2019 to tell everybody it had to happen in 2020. Then she comes out a few months later in 2020 to essentially repeat what she said in January, but this time around blame COVID, and everybody seemed to forget that she'd already postponed the referendum in January and, just went along with what she was saying. And then obviously 2021 came and went, and we come to 2022, and the focus is now on 2023. But it's quite interesting what this woman says here. And I should also add in the fact that all the bullshit prior to me putting on this clip, all that talk of Sturgeon waiting to see, and then we would have a referendum. If the UK decides to leave, then we would have the where was it? Didn't happen, did it? No, of course it fucking didn't. So Nicola Sturgeon had spent all of her fucking time that she had at her disposal to act upon a mandate. She spent all of that time either trying to advocate for a second EU referendum, the people's vote, fucking around trying to ensure that Brexit was stopped in its entirety, while also doing everything in her power to stall scupper Brexit. And of course, in doing so, rendered the time that she had in order to act upon her mandate nearly or next to nothing, and eventually it became nothing. So who's at fault? And again, what's this really about? Is this really about EU membership, or is this about independence? I think it's pretty self-explanatory that it's not the latter. It's always been about the former. Now that's okay. That's absolutely fine if you're one of these individuals that supports the EU and that's always what you've wanted. Independence is secondary to you. Fine, be my guest. Couldn't care. But do not fucking sit there and blur the lines between the two and imply that they are one and the same. Do not sit there and advocate for independence and LARP as an independent supporter / campaigner and call for IndieDef2 and claim you're part of an independence movement when the reality of the matter is you couldn't give two hoots about independence, because in the blink of an eye, the independence that you would for a brief moment obtain in your period of time between UK exit and EU entry, the minute that you entered the EU, that independence that you'd obtained upon leaving the UK would be gone. A stepping stone. That's all it would be.
Allowing the people of Scotland to choose our own future, and for goodness sake, when we look at everything that has been happening over years now in Westminster, the chaos, the instability, the unpredictability, then I think there are a growing number of people in Scotland who think actually we could do much better as an independent country in charge of our own fate, rather than having people like Boris Johnson.
People also want to know when you are going to table this legislation. And in 2017 you said autumn 2018 was the common sense time for another referendum. In autumn 18, you said you'd set out your plans for an independence referendum in the not too distant future. In autumn 2019, you said the referendum must happen next year. In autumn 2020, you said you wouldn't rule out a vote in 2021. And in 2021, you said you'd start pushing for a referendum in spring 2022.
She summarises it perfectly, really. Every year, they were fobbed off with more independence rhetoric that never came to pass. So all of those people back in 2016 that listened to Thin Lips in her little podcast, or should I say political broadcast, telling them all that I know that you all voted for me and gave me landslide victories. I acknowledge that. I know that you want independence. So here's what I'll do. Or here's what you need to do. If you vote to leave the European Union, you will never see a second referendum. So if you want that referendum, vote to remain in the EU. So they do just that. And had to witness for years this bitch essentially spit in their face while scapegoating them at the same time and making them false promises year after year, winning election after election after election, saying the same shit. And here we are. But the penny never drops for these individuals. It never drops. But I've gone on for long enough. Far too long. But obviously, at no point in any of the clips of old that I played, and they weren't selective clips, I just played the ones that are BBC and whatnot for the most part, never once did this boot make any reference to the revisionist history that she started to use out of desperation in the latter stages of her EU obsession. So, let that sink in for anybody that peddles her nonsense, or peddled it at the time. I would have forgotten all about the fact that she was doing this sort of shit, but it was just because their own little independence website actually re-uploaded it, or bringing attention to it again, essentially. So that's funny. Anyway, no, I stand corrected, sorry, and I do apologise. It's 3 a.m, I'm tired. It was from February, but it's the first time, to my knowledge, that she's done it since the days of old when she used to do it all the fucking time. Just nonsense. Fucking bullshit. But it's a talking point that seems to still win people over, you know. Oh, we'll win the next referendum, and how are you going to do that? Well, let's just revise history and nobody will argue against us. Well, maybe people fucking should, because that is what this bitch needs. I mean, even this shit here, before I go actually, look at this shit. All these photos, I know this isn't her actual Twitter, this is the First Minister's one, but all the photos that have come out after she told us all that we had to wear our face nappies for an additional 2 weeks, while simultaneously telling us intermittently throughout the entirety of this COVID briefing that took place that they're really effective, they really work, you know, blah blah fucking blah. She's a fat-headed fucking LARPing bitch, a feminist cunt, and the reality of the matter is she was photographed the day prior without her own face nappy on, came back up to Scotland the next day to tell us all that we had to wear them for another additional 2 weeks, and it's going to be enshrined in law, essentially, or legislated, and nobody called her out, and she got away with it scot-free and continued on her tirade day after day after day, all fucking week. All week she's been doing it, day after day after day, posing for more photos with her stupid fucking short haircuts and a face mask, LARPing like fuck. Why are you wearing a face mask? Because you quite clearly didn't feel the need to wear one when you were sat in amongst all the politicians with your baldy husband. Of course. Nobody calls it out, so. And again, that kind of brings us even a full circle again, because the fact that nobody ever calls it out means that she essentially got away with bullshitting her fan base back in 2016, getting them to vote a specific way with the idea that they were going to get a referendum, and it never came. You know? But she never gets called out. She is to a certain extent now. You know, you're starting to see some people fluctuate to different parties. Alba, for example. Long may it continue as far as I'm concerned. But we all know the reality of the matter here. This cultist feminist boots, the demagogue, Nicola Thinlips, the capuchin, will continue to win elections, making false promises. And if in the event that she manages to obtain that referendum, well, fucking happy days for her as far as she's concerned. But if she doesn't, that's fine too. Because she's in a position now where she bootlicks the United Nations on a daily basis and is centre stage for the entirety of the world as she shows off and pretends that she knows what she's talking about when it comes to climate change, etc. She is one of the biggest virtue signaling useful idiots or that I've ever seen in my lifetime. You know, how she's gone from sort of like the sort of thin-lipped, shy feminist to the overbearing, overconfident ignoramus that we see today, who's got a fucking haircut like a guy called Gary who works in a mechanic shop. Peace.